A motif is often the shortest piece of recognizable musical material in a piece. A motif can be the defining part of an entire theme or be a brief musical statement that stands completely on itself. However, a motif is not only something you could use when writing melodies, but it can also become a building block with which you can construct your entire piece. In today's video, I will go over how I use these two motifs as building blocks and how I develop them throughout a piece. If we talk about motifs and building blocks, we have to discuss the most famous building block of all time. Looking at the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony a little more in depth, we can see that this motif is present throughout the entire movement. The first theme consists of the motif with different intervals divided over the strings. When he starts moving towards the second theme, he already starts developing it. The short 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 motif leading towards the bar line is still present, but the long note now has been replaced with a short suspension. This allows Beethoven to follow the repetitions of it more closely together. When we reach the second theme, it starts to get interesting. Here Beethoven blends the motif into the background and it becomes more of an accompanying thing rather than the main element. He starts combining the second theme with the opening motif in the cello and basses. Even though the interval is different and even inversed compared to the opening, this rhythmic element is so recognizable that we still link this to the main motif. The motif has developed and he still uses it to great effect in other layers rather than the melody. If you would like to look at how Thomas Bergerson uses the same principle in his ostinato writing in Race to Durango, I recommend you check out this video for a breakdown. I talked about this same piece and how I orchestrated the opening in the last video. In this video I'll go over two building blocks I introduce in the first 20 seconds and how I develop them through the piece. The first building block is the repeated rhythm in the brass. This driving brass rhythm initially was something I really liked about the Verdi inspiration, to add some forward momentum to the orchestration. I decided to give this more prominence and make it the main thing that would drive the piece forward. The first time it comes back is in the build-up towards the main melodic section. At this point I have developed this idea slightly in two ways, alternating between instruments and displacing the rhythms. The alternating instruments idea was again something I really liked from the Verdi Dies Irae we discussed in the last video. The trumpets and trombones are alternating their punctuating rhythm in the build-up to the first climax, and this is an idea that I really liked. The horns and trombones now have the rhythm displaced by one beat and play towards the third beat of the bar. The trumpets stay in the same place rhythmically, causing the two rhythms to overlap and create even more drive forward. Wherever we are, the horns and trombones always play chord tones and the trumpets play a single note that is present in all the chords of this build-up. Doing this helps me to increase the tension in the build-up while making sure I use material that has been introduced already and is familiar to the listener. I could have easily thrown a lot more ideas at this section, but it could have made it feel cluttered while there's already quite a lot going on. After the main melodic section, the piece drops a bit in intensity. I decided to take this idea of alternating and displacing the different brass instruments even further. I separate the horns and trombones as well, so I now have three different groups of instruments and more variety in color and placement. Instead of having regular displacement over the whole section, I start treating the starting points of the different statements more freely. They can now start at any point in the bar, creating more irregularity and the right kind of tension that I was looking for in this section. Now before I can talk about the third development of the brass rhythm, I first need to discuss the second building block of this piece. The second building block is something I quietly introduced in the heavy string section. This is turned into a more prominent melodic figure right after. This fragment is something I use immediately as a melodic motif in the build-up. The notes we hear the first time this melody is played are exactly the same as the notes we hear in the first bar of the build-up. I only removed the descending line at the end. In this build-up, I use it as a way to add tension to the build-up. The contour of the motif remains intact, but the intervals now form around this section's chords. The second time this melody comes back is in the section where we left the brass the last time. Often, a melody's contour is already enough to make it recognizable without needing the exact intervals that we heard earlier. I use this notion to turn the melody into an ostinato pattern in the violins. Towards the end of this section, this melodic material is reintroduced as a melody, and this is where it gets interesting. Once you have established your building blocks in the ear of the listener, you can start mixing and matching them to create new material. You can do this in shorter pieces like this, but it would also work in the scope of longer projects such as film or game scores. Towards the end of this piece, I combine the two main building blocks that we discussed in this video. The horns have a very slight alternation to their repeated rhythm. The same concept as in the previous section with the free displacement continues, but I use the notes I cut off earlier from the ascending line to give it a little bit more melodic presence. The final combination of the two building blocks is when we combine the melody of the ascending line with the repeated brass note right before we have the last main melodic section. That's how I used building blocks to construct this piece coherently with material that I introduced in the opening. I hope this helps you to write longer pieces and take more out of the material you already have. If you're interested in this piece's full mix, stems and MIDI file, you can find those on my Patreon linked below. I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to my first ever Patreons, Danny Lynch and Kyle L. Danny and Kyle, thank you so much for your trust and support. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.